everybody. Thank you so much for joining us as part of the Growth at Home conference. My name is Jen Fisher, and I am a partner in the San Francisco office of Goodwin. I'm also the co-chair of Goodwin's Cannabis practice. And I'm joined today by Sarah Gersten, who is the General Counsel and Executive Director of the Last Prisoner Project. And I'm thrilled to be here with her today. We're going to be talking about all of the good work that LPP is doing for the cannabis community, and more specifically, the way that we as a law firm, Goodwin, have partnered with LPP to advance some of those goals and objectives. So I'd like to start by handing it over to Sarah to have her introduce herself to all of you and talk about the mission of the Last Prisoner Project.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. Thank you to the Growth Conference. We are delighted to be here and get to talk about some of those programs, and particularly the ones we're working on with Goodwin. As Jen mentioned, my name is Sarah Gersten. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel for the Last Prisoner Project. And the Last Prisoner Project was really founded on the belief that anyone in the cannabis industry, anyone that is profiting off of this plant, has a moral imperative, a duty to give back to those that are still suffering from the devastating consequences of the war on drugs and cannabis prohibition. Our founders are a group of cannabis executives and entrepreneurs, one of them being Steve D'Angelo, the godfather of the legal cannabis industry. And Steve, years ago, had kind of this epiphany where he was sitting in an office building, skyscraper, doing literally $1 million, multi-million-dollar deal, taking his company Harborside public. In the process of doing that, talking about, of course, the sales of tons and tons of cannabis legally in California. That's also something he had been doing already for a decade through California's medical program. And at the same time, Steve had a lot of friends and colleagues from the legacy market who were still incarcerated. And at that meeting that he talks about, this epiphany moment, after signing all the papers, he got a call from one of those friends who was incarcerated in Pennsylvania. And he was simply calling Steve to say, hey, I saw it's going to be snowy this weekend in Pennsylvania. Do you mind checking on my mom and just making sure she has someone to shovel her drive? And that call for Steve, of course, happening concurrently with doing this deal in Canada, it really hit him. I cannot participate in this legal industry if I'm not doing everything in my power to get every last cannabis prisoner released from incarceration. So again, the organization was really founded on that belief that those either profiting off of the legal industry or really even anyone participating in the industry as a consumer or otherwise has this duty to try to repair the harms of prohibition. And so it came both from that moral imperative, but also sort of a recognition of a need in this community and in this movement. We had seen, and particularly over the past few years, and this year even, we've seen a lot of broad reform efforts centered around things like social equity or expungements for cannabis crimes, which is retroactive relief for those who have already served their sentences, which is wonderful and something we certainly push for at LPP. But none of these initiatives go towards retroactive relief for those still incarcerated for cannabis offenses. So the Last Prisoner Project was really born out of the coalescing of those two things, this moral imperative, as well as this really big need for this community and this movement to do something for our cannabis prisoners who have been left behind by reform efforts.
I think that's so interesting, and it hits on a lot of the issues that we're grappling with in the industry as we're moving towards an expanded legalized market, and wanting to make sure that as more states come online and start offering legalized cannabis, that there is also a recognition that part of those policies have to address the past wrongs and all of these people that are still serving time in prison, which I think I know that when I started doing this work, many people I interacted with were surprised to learn that people are still serving these long prison sentences for what is now commercial cannabis activity that most people are engaging in sort of freely and without the threat of prosecution. And I think you really hit the nail on the head for me personally, and why I wanted to get involved in the Last Prisoner Project. Has so much to do with that moral imperative that you spoke of, Sarah. And I know that, Goodwin as a law firm, and particularly our cannabis practice, we work with cannabis companies at all levels of the supply chain. We also work with vertically integrated companies, small entrepreneurs, large MSOs, and we also do a lot of work with investors in the space, all of whom hopefully are or will be enjoying the profits of a legalized market. And part of our legal work is making sure that their businesses are best positioned to be able to take advantage of the expansion of legalization. And so for me, it was really important, especially because the team of lawyers that I work with in the cannabis practice at Goodwin are all very committed to the industry. We're, really interested in all of the developments of the industry, the innovation happening, the people entering the space, the people who've been in the space, and we have a real commitment to serving this industry. And for me, when I joined Goodwin in April, I really wanted to bring, sort of my passion for this moral imperative that Sarah speaks of to our law practice, to our cannabis law practice. And so that's kind of how Sarah and I got together and started talking about what we as a law firm could do to help people who are incarcerated and aren't enjoying the benefits of maybe expungement, or they've already been released and they need help finding jobs in the industry or with a reentry plan. All of that is great work. But what about the people that are being left behind because they're still in prison? They don't even have the opportunity to participate in the legal market. And how can we help those people? And so that's when we kind of started this really exciting compassionate release program. But Sarah, I'd love to have you describe a little bit more of what your vision for this program was, and also how COVID-19 and the racial unrest kind of played into the launching of this compassionate release program.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, Jen, it was really fortuitous timing when you reached out to me to want to get Goodwin involved with Last Prisoner Project, because it was right about the time that COVID was really ravaging communities across the country, and of course, particularly our incarcerated communities. Even still today, COVID presents a really urgent health risk for anyone that's currently incarcerated. Of course, the conditions of confinement make it practically impossible to do the basic measures that we're all taking on the outside to mitigate the risks of spreading COVID-19. It is impossible to social distance. You do not have access to basic hygiene measures, to masks, to hand sanitizer, and even the air you breathe, you don't have any control over. So we knew in March that COVID was going to be a really pressing risk for our constituents and really could turn a cannabis sentence into a death sentence for so many of our constituents, particularly those that are over the age of 65, have pre-existing conditions. And unfortunately, what we've seen is typically those constituents who are most at risk for contracting the virus are also those that are currently serving life sentences for nonviolent cannabis offenses. So a sentence that is already so unjust, sort of the most egregious sentences that we have, are now also the ones that are the most vulnerable. And so we knew immediately we had to do something to try to get as many of those particularly at-risk constituents out of incarceration. And luckily, under the First Step Act, which was a broad criminal justice bill passed in 2018, it allowed for those currently confined on the federal level to appeal to their sentencing judge for compassionate release. And typically that's something that you think of someone being at risk for some kind of health issue or, a terminal illness, taking advantage of compassionate release procedures. But again, under the First Step Act, we really saw this opportunity for individuals like our constituents, nonviolent drug offenders, to use compassionate release to essentially say there are compelling or extraordinary circumstances for why someone deserves release. And sometimes that could be that they received a really egregious sentence for something that today we would never impose that kind of lengthy sentence for. So sort of, again, the confluence of these two things, the availability of more opportunities for getting granted compassionate release under the First Step Act for our constituents, as well as COVID, led us to really pivot our legal services, which to that point had been confined to executive clemency, both on the federal and state level, to also start pursuing compassionate release for our constituents. And Jen, you, as well as the team at Goodwin, really had such a hand in developing and implementing that program. It is not at all an exaggeration to say we could not have implemented that program without your assistance. We really relied on pro bono attorneys, and the team at Goodwin stepped up in a huge way, not just to provide those attorneys, but to kind of work with us to develop the process for matching clients with attorneys, helping us create a brief bank for attorneys to access and additional resources. I mean, Jen, you yourself were kind of one of the first attorneys that took on one of those cases. And so now you constantly are acting as a resource to other attorneys within and outside of Goodwin on these types of cases. And so what Goodwin enabled us to do with this program was to really scale it. I think now we have something like 80 intakes for that program. And we're bringing on new law firms, new attorneys constantly. And through the procedures and the processes that we implemented with the assistance of Goodwin, we've been able to provide support for so many more constituents than I could have really ever envisioned. Again, this program, I think, in our heads in March, we really didn't understand the scale and the scope of COVID. Yeah. And it was sort of, I think we were thinking it would be sort of a stopgap release effort for a short period of time. I think that has drastically changed now that we really know, unfortunately, facilities are not reacting to COVID in the way we had hoped. Jurisdictions across the board are not releasing those particularly at-risk individuals. We've seen some release efforts on the state level particularly, and even the Bureau of Prisons, I think, is at its lowest level of inmates maybe ever, or at least in decades. And that's all progress, but it is not nearly enough when you look at the numbers that we still have incarcerated, and especially with COVID, many facilities in this country are over max capacity. They're so overcrowded. And unfortunately, again, they're simply not putting in place the kind of mechanisms that we need to help mitigate the spread of this virus. And so now our compassionate release program, I think, will be an ongoing program because the risk for COVID is ongoing. But I'm so happy that firms like Goodwin and you yourself, Jen, have stepped up to help Last Prisoner Project implement this program because it's providing relief for so many individuals, again, who are literally at risk of death because of COVID.
Yeah, and I think you hit on some really important points. I mean, we thought of this as kind of an emergency project. We wanted to get in and help as many people as we could, as quickly as we could. The wheels of justice turn very slowly. Unfortunately, we've also seen that to be the case. But I think, for people who are suffering from any medical conditions in prison that increase their risk of contracting COVID, it's a very dangerous and scary time for them. And I think, the First Step Act is wonderful and did create this other avenue for prisoners to seek release, compassionate release, without having to go strictly within the confines of the Bureau of Prison Appeals process. And really the First Step Act opened the door to incarcerated individuals' right to appeal directly to the federal court in which she or he was sentenced for compassionate release. But in order for them to do that and do that effectively, they need lawyers. And so that's where we all come in. And I hope anyone who's watching this who is interested in getting involved does reach out to me or Sarah, because we're always looking for more volunteer attorneys to take on this really impactful and exciting and very interesting pro bono work. We've seen from the constituents that Goodwin is representing that they each have a very compelling story to tell. Many of them are serving disproportionately long sentences for nonviolent cannabis offenses. And how we've chosen to, kind of approach this strategically is to use this really as a vehicle to educate federal judges on what's happening with criminal justice reform, and to kind of point out the injustices around these sentences, even to some of the judges who handed down these sentences in the first place, but were often constrained by the sentencing guidelines that were in place at the time. And for many of these people, they were sentenced a long time ago. And there have been reforms that have taken place since. So in addition to kind of taking each individual Last Prisoner Project constituent and humanizing them, really telling their story, talking about some of the medical conditions that they are suffering from, talk about the fear that they have about contracting COVID and what it might mean for their long-term health, talk about what it would mean for their family to see them released and re-entered into society. We work really closely with our constituents and their families to come up with a re-entry plan, which is something federal judges are very keen on seeing in any petition for release. But also, so all of that's very unique to each constituent we're working with. But we also are taking these motions as an opportunity to advocate for more broadly, and to educate federal judges about the cannabis industry and why and how states have moved so rapidly, really, towards legalization. And yet all of these people have been left behind because they're still serving sentences for nonviolent cannabis offenses. So really weaving that in, telling the story of legalization, talking about the medical research that's happening, talking about the wellness benefits and how so many state policymakers have opened the door to legalized cannabis. And that, I think, creates this real tension around these sentences that our constituents are serving for the activity that's now very profitable for people. I mean, a lot of these charges involve possession and with the intent to distribute cannabis, and that's exactly how people are making money in the legalized industry. And so, painting that whole picture, both of just the individual and why in each case compassionate release is warranted, because there are extraordinary and compelling circumstances that are unique to that client, to that individual, but also more broadly starting to set the stage for, I think, what I hope to see is broader reform in terms of criminal justice and sentencing and policing of cannabis offenses. And I think we all hope we see decriminalization happening sometime soon, but we can't wait for that while people are still serving time in prison. They need lawyers. They need lawyers to go into federal court and stand up and make an argument on their behalf as to why they deserve to be released. And that's what we're doing. And it's really fascinating work. And I'm so pleased to report that we had our first major success at the beginning of September. The Goodwin team had filed a motion for compassionate release on behalf of one of our LPP constituents named Philong Chuang. And our our motion was granted, and Mr. Schwang was released home to his family the Friday before Labor Day weekend. He's safely back with his family. He's thrilled. He's so relieved. The amount of joy and relief that his family expressed when we shared this good news with him was really one of the most rewarding moments for me in my career as a lawyer. And then to actually see him home with his family is so gratifying. And it inspires me to want to continue this work so we can help more people like Mr. Schwang.
And I think you brought up such an important point talking about the work in these motions, Jen, which is the policy arguments. And I know that was a piece of what was raised in Philong's motion. And that's so essential because to date, again, in our kind of legal avenues for relief, that's through executive clemency. And when we're working on the state level, it's easy in a state like Michigan or Illinois, when you're asking for clemency from that governor's office, to make the policy argument of, okay, this person is still imprisoned for something that now your state is bringing in millions of dollars in revenue to the state's economy. You as a governor have allowed for this legal system to take place. You can see why this disparity is so unjust. You need to release these cannabis prisoners. When we're trying to make that argument on the federal level, of course, we can talk about shifting attitudes, the need for, broad drug policy reform, but it's much more difficult to say there's this injustice because the laws really have not changed on the federal level. But something that we're able to do with these compassionate release motions, as you said, this goes back to the sentencing judge. So even though this is a federal offense, even though this is a judge that, sitting on the federal bench, they're sitting in that jurisdiction. And oftentimes we have constituents that are coming from jurisdictions that are now legal or have some kind of legal program. And so in a state like Pennsylvania or Maine or California, when you're talking to a federal judge, you can include those policy arguments talking about not just change in attitude, but change in laws, and really appeal again to that sense of justice and what is right and what is fair under the law, to say, in the state that you're sitting in, there's now a robust legal program, and this individual is still suffering due to cannabis prohibition. So I am so heartened to see the work that you guys are putting into these motions to make that policy argument. And like you said, that's setting a really important precedent for lots of lawyers and for judges to be able to make in future cases. So it's just such a critical aspect of what you guys are doing. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, thank you. I do think, we take a very individualized approach to each case, as I was mentioning, and really a big part of the work we're doing is humanizing these individuals and explaining, how incarceration has impacted them, particularly those that have a lot of medical problems. The prison will take the position that they're doing everything they can to provide access to treatment and care. And we really try and tell the story, from a different perspective, just how oftentimes the health has deteriorates for our constituents so rapidly because of the conditions of these prisons. And that's even more true in the era of COVID, where not all of the right precautions are being taken. And we've seen rapid spread of COVID in the prisons and in communities surrounding the facilities, which is also really important to point out to these judges. And so we're kind of looking at each individual and how incarceration has impacted them and weaving that into, and oftentimes in these, particularly in these COVID-focused motions, just talking about how much better off they would be if they were outside with their families, and how much we would be better able to protect their health and well-being than when they're incarcerated, and how it's really an injustice that they are incarcerated in the first place. And so really trying to become very vigorous advocates for each one of our clients and convincing judges that compassionate release is so warranted, not just because of COVID. That's sort of, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, it sort of spurred this project. It made it more imminent, more urgent that we needed to get people, particularly those at high risk, released. But we see this as a long-term partnership and work that will be ongoing, because there are many people in prison who are, very much deserving of compassionate release. And so we're working with them to put together the most persuasive set of arguments we can for each individual.
And it's something that I certainly feel very lucky to have it. I know you share this sentiment with the clients that Goodwin has taken on, but each of our constituents really, it's very easy to make that compelling argument of why not only are they not a danger or a threat to society, they really are a benefit to their community. I know we saw that with Philong, the testimony we got from friends and family members and community members all said, he was such a benefit to his community. He cared so much about his community. He was always giving back. He's a really selfless person. And I really see that across the board with our constituents. And I think that goes back to, again, this fundamental injustice, which is that these individuals, even ones that are serving life sentences, at the end of the day, they're serving these sentences for activity that, a majority of Americans in no way see as a crime. Of course, any of us operating within or even adjacent to this industry don't see these actions as a crime. And so it's not surprising that when we talk about the kind of constituents we're serving and we make that case to judges of why someone deserves release, I have found that it's quite easy because all of our constituents really share a lot of empathy for their community. They are across the board, I think, I don't think that they needed to be rehabilitated, but when you're making that argument to the judge, it's, all of our constituents have served as mentors while they've been incarcerated. They're using their time inside to give back and to do good. And so again, I found that it's been easy to make that argument of why someone is going to be a benefit to their community. And the other thing that you touched on is in the era of COVID, there is not only a compelling reason for why someone, even with a pre-existing condition, deserves release for their own medical and safety needs. Of course, that is the case. But there is an obvious argument that we can make for why releasing individuals, and particularly individuals like our constituents that really pose no danger to society, is a way that we can protect our communities at large. The spread of COVID within facilities doesn't just endanger our constituents and those incarcerated in those facilities. It endangers the individuals that are working at those facilities, the guards, the physicians, service workers, people coming in and out of those facilities every day. And of course, in turn, that endangers anyone in that community. And so again, there's an argument to be made that these kinds of release efforts are not just protecting our incarcerated constituents, they're protecting communities at large. So the work is just so important right now, so critical at this time where I think we need to be doing everything we can to mitigate the spread of this virus.
Picking up where Sarah left off, I think for the growth audience, so for all of you who may have tuned in to listen to this session because you'd maybe heard about Last Prisoner Project and wanted to learn more, or you're involved in the cannabis industry and you're looking for a way to kind of balance what you're doing professionally with your own interest in also pursuing social justice and criminal justice reform and really leveling the playing field for everyone in our industry. Thank you, first of all, for tuning in to listen to our discussion with Sarah Gersten today. But I also would encourage you to reach out and get involved. If you're a lawyer, wonderful. Welcome to the team. We'd love to have you on board for some of these pro bono representations that we've been talking about. But there's lots of other ways to get involved with and support the Last Prisoner Project. And so for all of you who are attending this wonderful Growth from Home conference, please reach out to me or to Sarah or to anyone at LPP. We'd love to really have as many people in our industry involved in this incredible organization as we can. In closing, Sarah, do you have any last comments besides my plea for volunteers and support?
Well, I will just echo that plea. There are really easy ways for anyone in the industry or cannabis consumers to get involved with this mission. Like Jen said, we are always looking for pro bono attorneys, but if you want to volunteer, we have, of course, the need for a wide range of different experiences. If you are an industry partner, we have a number of partnerships for companies in the cannabis industry. And one of the easiest ways I think cannabis companies can get involved is by promoting and within their own organization, implementing fair chance hiring and giving an opportunity for justice impacted individuals to have a stake in this industry, particularly as employees. We've seen robust movement in terms of social equity, but as a lot of my constituents tell me, they don't necessarily have an interest in being an entrepreneur or an operator in this industry, but they do have an interest in participating as an employee. And so I want companies to know that that's a really easy way to give back to this community and to pursue that mission of repairing the past harms of prohibition and the war on drugs. And we have an amazing cohort of constituents currently in our reentry program. So again, if you're interested in being involved in one of those partnerships as an industry partner, volunteering, or just getting involved in a number of ways with Last Prisoner Project, you can go to our website. It's lastprisonerproject.org/get-involved. And that will give you all of the different partnerships and ways that you as an individual or an organization can get involved with this project.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you to Jake Skinner and the whole team at Growth for giving Sarah and I the opportunity to share with you some of our experiences working together on behalf of the constituents of the Last Prisoner Project. It's really tremendously rewarding work, and I'm grateful to be involved in it. So Sarah, thank you for your friendship and for the opportunity to get involved in the work that you are doing. I'm most appreciative. And thank you to Growth for giving us this platform.